because he defied expectations and didn't lose as badly as he was expected to lose to Tulane in the final game of the season a couple of weeks later, and it saved his job until the next year when Huey did finally run him off. But when he took over the school, he really took over the school, and I don't mean in the way that you might say that John Bell Edwards or Bobby Jindal or even Edwin Edwards influenced LSU. This was not that kind of influence. This was literally running the school, seeing himself as the president, seeing the football coach, the band director, and the president as being assistants to him. Not that I'm your biggest booster. It's like you're literally working for me, and you do what I say. So it was these stories about him, his antics with the football team, his antics with the band, and I hesitate to use the word antics when I talk about what he did in some of the areas of academics where I think he jeopardized the school's accreditation. And by the time he died, the law school was about to lose its accreditation, and the SACS accrediting body was moving on LSU for loss of institutional control because of what he was doing there. But instead of telling the stories like I usually do, I'd like to tell them in a different context, and that is in the context of what do they mean for the politics today? What do they mean for LSU's future with a new governor, whoever that may be, coming into office next January, with potential new board members of the LSU board coming on, being appointed? What does this mean? And when you got John Bell Edwards Governor Edwards just saying the other day that he thinks that there's not that he thinks, but acknowledging the obvious, that there's a vast funding disparity between a school like LSU and Southern, and that we need to do something about that. What can we learn from Huey's experience and the LSU's long history of being embroiled in politics that began before Huey and has extended into present day? So one of the things that I learned is that I think we can learn from Huey's involvement with LSU is that governors, state leaders should support LSU but not control it, not try to run it. And the way I like to put it is cheer, don't coach. If Huey had stayed as the cheerleader, and he saw himself as not only the president, coach, band director, but as also the head cheerleader, because it was a hilarious story. One night after a game, he decided that the cheering wasn't as robust from the student section as it should have been. So he summons the entire student body to Tiger Stadium at one night and gives them direction on how to cheer better at the next game. So he really did see himself as the head cheerleader. And when he wasn't on the sidelines meddling with the coaches and telling the coaches what to do, he was in the stands leading the cheers. He really saw himself as the head cheerleader. But when he was at his best, he was finding new money for buildings. Now, we don't have time to talk about his methods for finding that money, which I wouldn't recommend to current leaders, but he found the money for new buildings. He raised the national profile of the school, and maybe you could question his methods for doing that. It was largely around the band and the football team, but he raised the profile of the school. He hired good leadership and let them run the school without too much interference. And I say too much. He definitely interfered, but he interfered in ways that people like James Monroe Smith, Fred Fry, Troy Middleton, and others didn't think really hurt the school. They were willing to make some compromises with him, give him some of what he wanted to get everything they wanted. They managed Huey. Pretty well. And James Monroe Smith, I'll go ahead and spoiler alert. He goes to prison at the end of the book, but the whole time that he was there when Huey was governor, and even beyond that, he was hiring. From best I could tell, he was hiring good people and letting them do their jobs. Charles Pipkin is a great example. The head of the graduate school, who was really responsible for going out and hiring amazing faculty members like Cleanth Brooks and Robert Penn Warren and a whole host of other bright lights who were willing to come to LSU, who wouldn't have even looked at LSU a couple of years earlier, were now willing to leave their cushy academic jobs up east and out west and come to LSU, come to Baton Rouge, which was nowheresville academically in 1928, 29, 1930. But when he took over the school, well, by the way, I should have mentioned, you know, he also was at his best when he was building, when he was expanding the school. So it was Huey's idea, along with Arthur Vadrine, the head of Charity Hospital, and subsequently the dean of the first dean of the medical school, to establish a medical school and a nursing school in New Orleans that the state desperately needed at that time. And they did it in under a year. They got it done in a year, which is pretty amazing. But when he took over the school and tried to serve as the president or head coach, that's when he hurt LSU, when he ran off the law school dean and tried to hire his replacement on a long-distance phone call, never having met the guy. That was not good for the school. And in fact, the accrediting body for law schools used that example of when Huey tried to hire Wayne Morse to be president of the university on a phone call without ever having met him, without having heard his name 15 minutes earlier, as one of the reasons why the law school might have soon lost its accreditation. When he ran off the football coaches, the two football coaches, Russ Cohen and Biff Jones, it had negative consequences for the school in a lot of ways, and one of them was that Huey, who desperately wanted LSU, like all the other fans of in this community, to go to the Rose Bowl someday, the head of the Rose Bowl said that as long as Huey Long is associated with LSU, we will never give LSU a Rose Bowl invitation. And this was when schools like Alabama and Tulane were going to the Rose Bowl and bringing national renown for their institutions in their states. And LSU, which Huey desperately wanted to have that kind of stature, was blocked because of his meddling with the football team. So support but don't control, cheer but don't coach. Number two, I would say that demand the best and don't abide too many delays. And again, that doesn't mean you have to get in and draw up the plans for the field house, which Huey supposedly did at Westdale Golf Course, now Webb Park Golf Course, where they brought in the plans for a swimming pool, and he designed sort of the rough outlines of a building around it, and went down there and kind of ruined the swimming pool because it was Olympic length until Huey goes down there and decides that he wants it to be the longest swimming pool in the country and makes them add 10 feet to it, and kind of ruins it as an Olympic size swimming pool. When he was meddling in those ways, he was hurting the school. But when he insisted that things be done quickly, that LSU have the best of everything, I think he was doing what was good for LSU. And from 1930, when he really took on, late 1930, when he really took on LSU as a project, to 1932, 1933, just 2 or 3 years, LSU's reputation nationally skyrocketed, and it wasn't just because of its football team and the band. It was because it was seen as a decidedly better academic place, and it was largely because good faculty members were willing to come here, and it was also more students were coming here. You know, when Huey took the school over, when Huey became governor, LSU's enrollment was around 1,600. By the time he died, it was over 6,000. So it was being seen as a school that young people from around the state, all of them white, unfortunately, wanted to come to and learn and get an education. He found money for new faculty. He found money for what LSU's infrastructure needs and housing. The women's dorm, Pleasant Hall, then Smith Hall, the field house, OK Allen Hall, the Tiger Stadium expansion. A lot of people have asked me about the Tiger Stadium expansion, putting dorm rooms under the stadium. That was not Huey's idea. That was something that LSU had been discussing in the mid-20s forward. But the reason they did it was because of the numbers of kids who were flocking to LSU. They didn't have room for them. It's the reason they built Pleasant Hall, because that was the women's dorm. They needed room for this exploding enrollment at LSU. At one point, I estimate that about 40% of the student body was living in Tiger Stadium because they just desperately needed room for these students. It was the journalism building in my school, which was in Alumni Hall, the LSU Medical School, the nursing school, on and on. When he decided he wanted a medical school, he didn't say, hey, let's have a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan for a medical school. They decided to build a medical school in the fall of 1930, and by the fall of 1931, there was a medical school in New Orleans up and running. The field house that's just been restored, for example. That building, it took them over 2 years, to renovate it. Maybe it was 3 years, but at least 2 years to renovate it. I went back and refreshed my memory the other day. In the fall, in the spring of 1931, in May of 1931, they went out, they advertised for bids. They opened the bids in June, maybe it was June or July of that year, 1931. They opened the building in May of the next year. They built it under a year. Now, they didn't have OSHA, and they didn't have, all the regulations that you would have to abide by, but they didn't waste time. They got these buildings up and running, and by the way, those buildings in the heart of campus, those buildings, the old historic buildings built in the 20s and 30s are the best buildings on campus. So the ones that have, as the head of facility services said to me, that they have really good bones. And the buildings they wanted, the buildings that the school wants to tear down, the library, Lockett Hall, those kind of buildings, are the buildings that were built in the 50s. And so they did them fast, but they did them really well. The other lesson, I think, is what we do today has repercussions 70 to 100 years from now in terms of generational wealth. When we made it almost impossible for black students to attend college in Louisiana, we were making the lives of their children and their grandchildren harder. When we made it impossible for black undergraduates to go to LSU for the first 100 years of its existence, we were making decisions about the wealth that would be handed down in 1970 and 2000, 2030. In the same way, we're making decisions today that will have positive or negative results in families in 2050, 2080, and beyond. And this is the part that I thought that I felt really important to talk about and acknowledge the racial implications of education in Louisiana in those days. And so we're just going to just quickly review this. The governor rightly talks about the need to support Southern, and then there's a legacy of non-support for Southern in this state that goes back to those days. In 1930, LSU had Southern University had 299 students. In 1940, they had 876 students, so it was almost a 200% increase, or more than a 200% increase. But still, by 1940, only 7% of Louisiana college students were black. So it was still overwhelmingly a white student body across the state. And that was because of what was going on in black high schools in Louisiana. In 1928, there were only 3 4-year high schools in the entire state for black students. Only 3. So there were only 3. In that year, there were only 353 black graduates of a 4-year high school in Louisiana. No, I'm sorry. That's not true. I'm reading the wrong number here. There were 3 4-year high schools for blacks, 353 for whites, and there were 434 black graduates compared to 6,500 white graduates. So the disparity was really wide. By 1940, the numbers of black high schools had increased to 39. But there were still 378 4-year white high schools in the state. And so in that year, when Huey had sort of finished, when Huey was dead and the long organization had sort of run its course running the state, there were 74,000 white high school graduates in 1940 compared to 1,128 black graduates. So the disparities there, I think, have consequences for us today. There's a lot of generational wealth that was not allowed to go into the hands of black families because they were blocked out at almost every level from entering higher education, much less LSU. And then finally, I just want to talk about the library, because people ask me about the library all the time, and it's been the thing that I've talked about the most in my public comments about LSU. There's no way that Huey Long would have let LSU's library molder for 25 yehave and it's an insult to LSU. It's an insult to the people who invested, the students who have been forced to use that decrepit facility. It's an insult to the people who poured their blood, sweat, and tears into building this university. It's a sad disgraceful symbol of Louisiana's disregard for higher education, and Huey Long wouldn't have stood for it, and neither should we. And so I hope that whatever this new administration and legislature does about LSU, they get serious about replacing the library, because so far they've not done that. They say they've given money to LSU for a library, but that's all Category 5 money. I won't bore you with details about Category 5 money, but if you know anything about the capital outlay budget, that's about the equivalent of monopoly money, and they really need to put serious money into building a new library. My wife and I, my wife Cindy is here, by the way, with me, and we were up in North Carolina recently, and we went to we stopped in and wandered around the North Carolina State University campus in Raleigh. Two brand new libraries, two magnificent brand new libraries on that campus. Massive libraries. There are states around the country that are making investments in their higher education that we're not. And I challenge you, next time you're going through North Carolina, don't go to UNC, don't go to Duke, go to the North Carolina State and just see what they've got, and then come back to the LSU campus and ask your legislators, ask whoever the new governor is, why can't we have that here? And it's because I think we've chosen not to. So with that, I want to say again, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for honoring me with an invitation to speak here, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about the book or anything else. Yes, sir.
Encyclopedia Britannica is gone. Are libraries really required nowadays in our universities?
Are libraries now required today in our universities? Absolutely, absolutely. This book would not have been possible without the LSU library, the Hill Library Special Collections, but also the formerly known as the library formerly known as the Middleton Library. The librarians, the assistance of the librarians there, reference librarians, but also interlibrary loan, because there were a lot of because we've so underfunded our library, a lot of the books, journal articles that I needed, we didn't even have, and so I had to go through interlibrary loan, and they borrowed them for me from other libraries, which is a really nice service. You go into that library, even as bad as it is, as nasty as it is, as bad as it smells, there's always students. Students still use it. Students are there. Students make use of it, but just as important, maybe not more importantly, but just as important, faculty need good libraries, need good resources. It doesn't necessarily mean that the library has to be as big as the old one. It doesn't mean that the library has to look the way that the old one did. But if you go to any good school, any good school in any school with a national reputation in this country, they're not going to have a library like ours. They're going to have a really good library. They're going to be proud of their library, and they're going to invest in it. And so yes, universities desperately need libraries. You can't have a university without a good library. I just don't think it's possible. Yes, yes, sir.
So to your story about building up Tiger Stadium.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always said the story, and I like mine better. You can say, oh yeah, that's right. Heard that there was a lot of federal money available.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's just say, he was able to procure money to build campus. There was no money for a football team, so he told the contractors, build a building right here, build a building right here, make it a dorm, but I want them this far apart, and then part of the contract is you're going to build some escalating stairs coming off the side.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to have football.
So the question was, did Huey scheme to build a stadium by calling it a dorm? Is basically none of that happened. I'm sorry to tell you, Barry, that none of that happened. That is none of it happened. First of all, the idea for Tiger Stadium had been there 4 years. The basics of Tiger Stadium was already there 4 years before Huey became governor. So when he became governor, there was a Tiger Stadium, and they expanded it when they started expanding it, and that's when Skipper Hurd, who was the longtime athletic director, he started out as a graduate student and became the athletic director into the 50s. It was his idea that he brought to Huey, and it was federal. It was about $250,000 of state money, not federal money, that they had. And Hurd remembered this idea, floated around LSU right after they built Tiger Stadium in 1925-26, and took it to James Monroe Smith, who I'm sure took it to Huey, but they immediately said, let's do this. It makes sense to do this. But they were doing it with state money. And the reason one of the reasons why they weren't doing it with federal money is because, as you may recall, Huey was at war with Franklin Roosevelt for most of his time as a U.S. Senator. And the Roosevelt administration had pretty much cut off federal funding to Louisiana for almost anything. And it was only after Huey's death and Dick Lesh becomes governor and goes to Washington and makes peace with the Roosevelt administration that the federal spigot got turned on again. And so a lot of the federal money, New Deal money that came into the LSU campus to build a lot of that stuff, including, I think, some Tiger Stadium money, that all came after Huey's death. That was all New Deal money that came in after Dick Lesh repaired the breach. So sorry to spoil your story. Yes, sir.
Folk are always talking about the terrible condition of the LSU library. But how would you rank it as amongst the other libraries?
How would I rank LSU? Yes, thank you for asking that question, because how would I rank LSU's library compared to other libraries? And so when I had a column in the Times-Picayune and was writing about this a lot, I spent a day at the Southern campus because I wanted to see their library too, and I wanted to see just the facilities that where I was complaining about LSU. I wanted to see what was going on at Southern, and I was taken aback by what I saw at Southern. Although I will say that I thought at the time I thought the Southern library was in better shape than the LSU library as far as just the presentation of it. I wasn't getting into the funding for books and journal articles, but it was the LSU library, pretty nasty, still is. But Southern needed help too, and there was a lot of. I'll be happy to give you a copy of what I wrote about it. But I was really appalled at what I saw about Southern, and I think I still would be. Yeah. Oh yeah, well, you go just about any campus on this college campus in this state, and you'll see a better. I was up at the first LSU facility that I spoke in about this book was at the LSU library in Shreveport, and they got a beautiful library facility up there. My alma mater, ULM, formerly Northeast, has a beautiful library built with state money. So almost I've done some research for my next book at the library at Southeastern. Nice library. So just about everybody in the state's got a better library than LSU. Yes.
Texas A&M until recent history didn't have women, and LSU's the old war school.
Mm-hmm.
We got Tigerland, women have romance, they get pregnant, particularly in the What's your opinion why LSU has women attached?
What's my opinion about why LSU had women? Well, so it's an interesting story. When Huey became governor, so when Huey became governor, the women students were still living at the old campus where around in and around where the state capitol is now, and they would take a train in the morning, along with a lot of faculty members who were still living up there. Would take a train down and later a bus to campus and go to school, and that's why they built the women's dorm. But Huey was just thinking aloud and said, well, maybe we ought to just make it an all-male institution. And Smith explained to him that co-ed education was the new development in higher education around the country, and that it was a positive development, and that LSU at the time had a lot of women students, and we would be going against the grain in educational reform in this country if we went back to just making it a purely military school or agriculture school that the people before Huey dreamed of. So, when John Parker and the people who were sort of in charge of LSU in 1919, 1918, 1920, when they wanted to move LSU to the current campus, they only had the aspiration for LSU to be a better agricultural institution. They just wanted more land for agricultural experiments. They had no ambition to make it a better, bigger school that served a much broader swath of the public in Louisiana. And it was people like Atkinson and Smith and others who had a different vision for the school. They wanted a bigger school. They wanted it to be what it is now, a state flagship university with a national reputation. They knew that couldn't happen if this was just an all-male institution. So I think Long and Smith made the right call not to go in that direction, but keep going the direction that LSU was going. Bobby?
How can LSU be consistently funded well so that they can do what they need to do?
How can LSU be consistently funded well so they can keep doing what they need to do? Well, I think, one thing we're going to have to, when I came to teach at LSU almost 18 years ago, roughly 75% of the LSU's budget was coming from state appropriations, 25% from self-generated funds. It's now almost flipped, where it's 75% self-generated funds, fees and tuitions, 25% state money. That's just very rough approximation of the ratio, but it's pretty much flipped, and that means that students are paying a lot more. We made it harder for students to get, to be able to afford to come here and get an education. I think that states are going to have to play a bigger role. We can't continue making it only something that kids with means can get, or that you have to get a journalism degree. You got to amass $200,000 in debt, and some of you who are in journalism you can tell me better than anybody how easy it would be to pay off a $200,000 debt on a beginning journalist salary. I don't think it would be that easy. So the state's got to step up and do more. I think the state's got to step up and do more. But I think schools like LSU have got also to take a hard look at where they have grown. And a lot of that has been in sort of middle and upper management, where we got these, every time anybody comes into the school, a new provost, a new president, they hire they create these new jobs, paying $300,000 a year, and nobody knows what they do. And then they're here, the guy that President Tate hired to be the head of strategery, he came in and he didn't even finish putting the strategy together, and he left. He's gone to West Point, leaving someone else to pick up the pieces. We're paying him pretty well for a couple of years for a job that he didn't even complete. So I think the state's got to do more, but LSU's got to do more, not to support what's going on in the classroom, and not just more people being paid a lot of money to occupy a paneled office somewhere in the system office. Yes, sir.
Hey, Bob. I'm more just a vision question. What do you see it as the vision itself, as what the future is for LSU, and who's the keeper of that vision?
What is the vision for LSU, and who's the keeper of that vision? Boy, that's a really good question. So I don't know. I'm not here speaking for LSU. Let me just be really clear. I do not speak for LSU. So whatever I say is the opinion of a mass comm professor. But I think the vision leaves something to be desired. The president's scholarship first agenda that he announced a year or two ago, I call it humanities last. Or really, to call it humanities last is not doing it service, because humanities wasn't mentioned. There is no humanities in his Pentagon plan. And I think that a school that wants to call itself a flagship university for a state ought to have an emphasis on the humanities, and we don't have any. So I don't know I don't know where you got that vision, but I'm not a big fan of it. Yes, sir.
Do you think that Huey Long would have allowed a team of TAF to siphon off most of the donations?
Probably. I don't know. So the idea of TAF and the idea of all that money, and Huey probably wouldn't have understood it. A guy who came up with a deduct box probably would have been blown away by the money in college football. He would have probably thought it was obscene. That's how. The scale of everything would be inconceivable to people in the 1930s. The scale of everything today. It was a small time operation. And I'll give you a couple examples. We paid the football coach about $7,000 a year. When he had a really successful season, they gave him a $500 a year raise. Harry Ravenhorst, who's a figure in the book, was the assistant coach who's all kind of sat on the sidelines with Huey and sort of tried to keep him under control. He was also the baseball coach and the basketball coach. Pop Gilbo, who was the band director that Huey fired, was also the groundskeeper. So so this was a really small time operation, and I don't think that, and the idea, even what coaches did in those days was vastly different from how coaches see themselves today. They weren't even, technically, they weren't allowed to coach during the games. I mean, their job was to train the players during the week and leave them alone during the game. And that's, what made Huey's behavior on the sideline so egregious, is because he was doing what coaches weren't allowed to do during a game. But it was just, so I just think that it wouldn't even compute to him. I mean, he wouldn't be opposed to it probably, but he wouldn't understand it, I don't think. Yes, sir.
This is a gear shifting kind of question.
A gear shifting question.
But you mentioned Lanny, and I know guys like you and Lanny have, maybe they can joke to me, I don't know, been suggested that you might want to consider running for office or something like that. Is there any possibility of qualifying?
Well, I would definitely vote for Lanny. I would definitely vote for Lanny. Yeah. He's saying that for those of you, he's saying that Lanny Keller and I should run for office, but I don't think that's going to happen. Yes, sir, Mr. Responding.
Kingfish, she had Williams, but it's that years they've always talked about what happened when now I'm going again, got that French there. When the circus was coming.
Oh, when the circus came to town.
Same time.
Yep.
Shenanigans, they pulled
Yeah.
that about dipping, and then when they wanted to go to Tennessee, the students, what
Right.
got in session.
Right. So he.
Do you think that any governor since that had come close to anything like that strong?
So the first, I'm going to make you go sit by Barry because because the first question was about Huey making the circus dip, or threatening to make the circus dip tigers if they try to hold a circus performance on the same day or the same time of an LSU game. That didn't happen. So that was just another myth. I mean, it sounded exactly like something you would do. So I understand why people believe that it happened, because it sounded exactly like the kind of stuff he did do. But T.Harry Williams did most of the work, but I followed up on his work and found that the circus was never scheduled to be performing on a day of a home game in Baton Rouge in either 1933 or 34, when some people said it was the SMU game, some people said it was a Rice game. I never found anything that lined up. They were either here the day before, they were in New Orleans, and I looked, and the circus had announced these schedules way in advance, so you could say, well, maybe they changed it at the end, but it was, so it doesn't. I don't think it was true. And the first evidence of that story that I found was by Harnett Kane in a news story in like 1938. So it was yeah. But what the other part of your story about Huey taking the student body and the cadets and the band on this big odyssey to Nashville for the Vanderbilt game in October 1934 definitely happened, and Huey Long stood at his door in his hotel suite at the Heidelberg Hotel, handing out $7 to students and writing their names on the back of laundry slips. And I think my memory's failing me, but I think he loaned about $7,000 that day to students, and maybe not that much, but anyway, he loaned a lot of money to a lot of students. And he, after it was over, I love it. He said, "I didn't know we had so many students with the last name Smith." But it was an amazing trip, and it made national news. And it's one of the things that I give Long credit is he knew how to create a spectacle. He knew how to put LSU on the map. So when he goes up there to Nashville with the student body and the cadets and the band on the train, the national press was covering this thing. It was in the New York Times. It was in all the papers, and he goosed the publicity a little bit by leaking the news that he might announce for president while he was in Nashville, so that even there was even more attention to this thing. And so when they get to the train station, they march through town with this parade with Huey at the front of the parade. There's over 100,000 people coming out in Nashville to see this guy, and that's what he did wherever they went. And he did it in Houston, he did it in Jackson. He took the band down to New Orleans on a number of occasions and led them through parades. He was raising the profile of LSU, but he was also raising his own profile for sure. But he knew how to use these. He knew how to use what he was building to raise the profile of the university, and I think it was good for the university. It was really good for the university. Yeah.
Even Bobby General, one of our most athletic governors, religiously attended games and was there on the field after big wins. The same is true of
governors before, as you note in your book, and governors today.
Yes.
John Bell Edwards, the quarterback at A.A. High School,
Right.
likes to throw passes on
Right, right.
the field, right? Is this a new phenomenon of the politician trying to embrace the imagery? As our friend Dick White wrote about Will Rogers and Calvin Coolidge having him to dinner to schmooze with him.
Yeah. Is this a new phenomenon to, is this obsession with the football team a new phenomenon with Huey, you mean?
With politics.
With politics in general? I think so. I think Huey sort of showed, again, Henry Fuqua, who was the governor before Huey did this too, not to Huey's extent. One thing about Huey was that I think worth remembering is that after the attempted impeachment, after the impeachment and his acquittal in the Senate, he felt like he was being shut out by a lot of newspapers, these analog newspapers. He thought he was finding it hard to get his name in the newspapers, or at least in a kind of positive way. And I believe that he calculated that if he could get into the newspapers as a booster of the football team, associating himself in a nonpartisan way with a sport that people really loved and cared about, that it would humanize him in a way, it would depoliticize him, and it would make the boosters of the most really popular school in the state look on him as different in a different way. And I think that's why he started out. He wanted to be seen as a booster, but I think he also thought that there was a lot of good to come from really running the school and being the cheerleader, being so publicly on the sidelines, sitting in place, not because he knew anything about football. He thought he could really help the team. He knew nothing about football, by the way, but he thought that it would. I think he calculated how it would look good. And when the team won, this was amazing to me. When it was, I found this story that I think it was an Advocate reporter wrote after LSU beat Arkansas at one of the state fair games in Shreveport. They gave Huey Long some credit for having rallied the team on the sidelines and in the locker room. And I think he knew that. I don't think he really cared about football that much. I think he cared about how it would make him look less political, and he would associate himself with something that culturally was very important to a lot of Louisianians. And I think that's why every other governor, as you correctly point out, Lanny, has done that to some degree or another. And, Huey just took it to an absurd degree.
We got time for one more
Okay.
question.
Bill?
Do you think Huey would have supported or advocated for some of these teacher colleges, junior colleges to become ultimately four-year colleges, kind of compete with LSU?
Yeah, I do. In fact, I think he didn't do as much for other universities as he could have or should have. In fact, one of the universities, one I think one of his first vetoes, if not his first veto, when he became governor, was a $75,000 appropriation for Southeastern. And no one really knew. He didn't explain why he vetoed their appropriation. No one really understands why he did it. But it was remembered over there, let me tell you. And when Jimmy Noe, who was in the Senate at the time, persuaded Long to turn the junior college up in Monroe into the northeast center of LSU, people in Ruston freaked out. In fact, I found this wonderful headline in the Ruston Daily Leader that said, "LSU becomes octopus of the state." And they were really, so places like people, community, legislators, there was a lot of outrage among legislators in and around, Lincoln Parish about this. But people who are representing schools in Lafayette and Natchitoches, Ruston, were really worried that they saw LSU gaining at their expense. And has anything really changed? I think they sort of, to me, it explains why long ago this began to happen. And I think it's always been, I've always said that every mile you go away from LSU, support for LSU in the state drops because people are really loyal to their schools in Monroe and Shreveport and wherever else. And I think that goes back to when Huey sort of inadvertently, maybe he didn't plan to, but kind of pitted them against each other and they saw LSU as a threat because remember, this is all in the depths of the Great Depression. There's not a lot of money to go around. And so LSU is getting a big piece of that pie. And these schools in Ruston and Monroe and Alexandria, wherever else, they want a piece of that pie too, and they're seeing themselves not getting it. And that's still the case in some ways, yeah.
We got to cut it off here, Bob.
Thank you very much.